It started as the kind of project families dream about all winter long. A backyard pool. The Peterson family had been planning it for 2 years, and by the second week of May 2024, the ground in their backyard in Harrifield, Indiana, was finally ready to be broken open. The excavation crew arrived on a Monday morning with a standard timeline. 2 days to clear the basin, maybe 3 if the soil gave them trouble. Nobody expected trouble. This was a quiet neighborhood. This was a quiet yard. The second afternoon, the operator felt something push back. Not the usual resistance of compacted clay or a buried root system. This was hard, deliberate. A deep metallic groan traveled up through the arm of the machine and into the cab. He cut the engine, climbed down, and crouched at the edge of the pit. Through the disturbed earth and the iron smell of wet Indiana clay, a surface was emerging that did not belong to the ground. A curve of steel, a seam, the unmistakable geometry of a vehicle. Not a water tank, not a buried drum. A car, fully buried, deliberately buried, at least 2 meters below a lawn that had been mowed every summer for decades by families who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. What was discovered inside that pit would open a case sealed in silence since 1952. At the center of it all was a young woman named Madison and Clark, someone her town once knew, and then, without explanation, lost forever. Stay with us, because what the earth held onto for 72 years is more than anyone was prepared to find. Madison and Clark was 26 years old in the autumn of 1952. She had grown up in Harrifield, a modest community on the western edge of Vanderburgh County, roughly 12 miles from Evansville. Her father, Gerald, worked for the Illinois Central Railroad. Her mother, Ruth, kept the house on Sycamore Lane, a white clapboard 2-story with a wraparound porch and a vegetable garden tended with the focus of someone who needed something to tend. Madison was their only child. That detail, small on its surface, hung heavily over everything that followed. She had dark brown hair she pinned back during the week, warm eyes no one could quite agree on the color of, and a habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was listening, which she nearly always was. She laughed easily. She remembered birthdays. Since the spring of 1951, she had worked as a secretary at the Harrifield Town Hall, arriving 15 minutes before anyone else, treating the land records and permit files as though they mattered, because in her view they did. The morning she received the job offer, her father, Gerald, had given her a brooch, silver, cast in the shape of a swallow in mid-flight. He had bought it at Dreyer's Jewelers on Main Street in Evansville for $3.25 and wrapped it himself in brown paper. Madison wore it every single day after that, on the left lapel of her blue wool coat in winter, on the collar of her cotton blouse in the warmer months. People who knew her could not picture her without it. By fall of 1952, she was planning a future with Daniel Brown, a 29-year-old accountant from Terre Haute who had come to work at a local grain cooperative. They had met at a church social, and by summer were understood by everyone to be building towards something permanent. Madison's mother, Ruth, had already begun setting aside fabric. Friday, the 17th of October, was cold and overcast, the kind of day that smells like the end of something. Madison wore her blue wool coat. The silver swallow was pinned to the left lapel. She said good night to her colleagues, walked out of the town hall at 5:15, and got in her 1950 Ford, faded blue-gray. Her father had helped her choose it. She was 12 minutes from home. She was never seen again. The route from the town hall to her parents' house on Sycamore Lane was straightforward, south on Millbrook Road, left onto County Road 14, then north on Fielding Street. 12 minutes in normal conditions. Ruth had pot roast in the oven. Gerald came in from the yard at 5:40. By 6 o'clock, the table was set and Madison's chair was empty. Gerald telephoned her rental on Birch Street at 6:15. No answer. He called Daniel Brown at his boarding house on Wheeler Avenue at 6:30. Daniel had not heard from her. He came over immediately. By 7, the three of them sat in the Clark kitchen with untouched food, listening to the wind and trying not to say what each of them was beginning to think. Daniel drove Millbrook Road twice that night, headlights sweeping the ditches. He drove County Road 14 end to end. He stopped at the only open filling station and asked if anyone had seen a blue-gray Ford sedan. No one had. By midnight, the temperature had dropped below freezing and a light sleet was falling, coating the roads in a thin skin of ice that erased whatever might have remained to find. Gerald contacted the Harrifield Police Department the following morning at 7:45. The prevailing assumption, one investigators returned to repeatedly, was that Madison had left of her own accord. Gerald did not accept this. He had spoken to her by phone the previous Thursday. She had reminded her mother to set aside pot roast leftovers to bring to Daniel on Saturday. These were not the words of someone planning a disappearance. That weekend, neighbors searched the drainage ditches along County Road 14. Men from Madison's church walked the shallow ravine behind the properties on the south end of Millbrook Road. They found nothing. No tire marks. No personal effects. In the car, a distinctive blue-gray Ford with an Indiana plate registered in the county had vanished just as completely as its owner. Notices went to filling stations and garages across 3 counties. No mechanic had touched it. No highway patrol officer had run the plates. After 2 weeks, attention turned to a man named Stephen Clark, no relation to Madison, though the shared surname tangled early paperwork for years afterward. Stephen Clark was 34, a maintenance worker with the County Public Works Department who had spent much of the past year working in and around the town hall. His role gave him familiarity with the office staff's routines, knowledge of quiet county roads and vacant parcels, and regular access to the heavy equipment the department used for earthwork across Vanderburgh County. 2 co-workers independently recalled, after the disappearance, that Stephen had once asked a clerk what time the office secretaries typically left for the day. Before investigators could press him further, Stephen Clark resigned on the 6th of November, vacated his room on Patterson Street, and left Harrifield without a forwarding address. Inquiries to a prior address in Owensboro, Kentucky, went unanswered. By December, the active file had grown thin. The lead detective was reassigned. The case was not closed. It was simply set aside, the way difficult things sometimes are when the ground stops giving anything back. Gerald and Ruth Clark never stopped waiting. Gerald wrote letters to the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office and to the Indiana State Police for years. He received polite, careful replies that promised attention and delivered very little. Ruth kept Madison's bedroom on Sycamore Lane exactly as it had been. Bedspread smooth, dresser undisturbed, the graduation photograph on the nightstand. Visitors understood without being told that it was not a room to enter casually. At the town hall, Harold Vance resisted pressure to fill Madison's position for 2 full years. When a vacancy was finally posted in late 1954, one clerk resigned rather than watch someone else sit at her desk. The case was briefly re-examined in 1971 by an Indiana State Police cold case detective reviewing older files. He noted the Stephen Clark angle, filed a renewed inquiry to Kentucky, received nothing useful, and returned the file to storage. Gerald Clark died in 1978 at 73, still without an answer. Ruth followed in 1984. Neither of them knew that Madison lay less than 2 miles from the house on Sycamore Lane. Daniel Brown moved to Cincinnati in 1957, married, and lived quietly until 2003. His wife told a county historian years later that he had kept a single photograph of Madison, a summer picnic snapshot from 1951, in the back of his desk drawer until the day he died. In 1952, the land at 1442 Crestwood Drive on Harrifield's southwestern edge was an undeveloped lot. Open ground at the end of a newly graded road, in a part of town just beginning to expand. No close neighbors, no fences, very little light after dark. A man with knowledge of county equipment and vacant parcels. A man whose job required him to know exactly which patches of ground were quiet and which machinery sat unattended in a department yard after hours, would have understood precisely what that lot offered. A family named Hartwell bought the lot in 1955 and built the house that still stands there. The Carmichaels came next, added a porch and a row of arborvitae. The Petersons acquired the property in 2019. None of them ever had reason to dig more than a foot or 2 into the backyard. The excavation crew from Kellner Landscaping and Pools broke ground on Monday, the 13th of May, 2024. The pool basin required a depth of approximately 2.5 meters. On Tuesday afternoon, the 14th of May, At approximately 2:15, the bucket met resistance at just under 2 meters. The crew's supervisor, 23 years of experience, recognized the sound immediately. Not rock, not a utility line, something hollow, something designed to contain space. He cut the engine. Within an hour, hand tools had exposed the curve of a roof panel and the collapsed frame of what had once been a windshield. The Evansville Police Department's Major Crimes Unit arrived by 5 that afternoon. The forensic team that began work the following morning identified the vehicle as a 1950 Ford sedan. The clay-dense Indiana soil had preserved the car's structural identity well beyond what 7 decades underground would ordinarily allow. Inside and in the surrounding soil, technicians found fragmented bone material, disarticulated, scattered by decades of ground movement and root intrusion. No intact arrangement remained. Cause of death was not determinable. Nothing could be stated with certainty except this. Someone had been in that car when it went into the ground, and the ground had kept them there. The license plate came back 4 days later. The plate had been issued by the state of Indiana in 1951. The registered owner was Madison and Clark of Birch Street, Harrifield, missing since Friday, the 17th of October, 1952. For 72 years, she had been less than 2 miles from the house where her parents had waited for her to come home for dinner. Among the items cataloged from the vehicle and surrounding soil, one object had survived the decades with a stubborn, almost defiant clarity. Small, no larger than a silver dollar. Oxidized to a deep, uneven gray, the pin clasp corroded shut. But its shape was unmistakable. A swallow, cast in silver, wings extended, caught in the permanent stillness of mid-flight. The brooch Gerald Clark had bought at Dreyer's Jewelers in the spring of 1951. The one Madison had worn every single day for the year and a half that followed, had been waiting in the clay of that Harrifield backyard since the autumn she disappeared. The DNA recovered from the bone fragments was too degraded after 7 decades for a conclusive profile. But the vehicle, the license plate, and the brooch, documented in multiple witness statements from 1952 as Madison Clark's most recognizable personal possession, were sufficient for the Vanderburgh County Coroner's Office to issue a presumptive identification. In September of 2024, a death certificate was issued for Madison and Clark. Date of death: on or after the 17th of October, 1952. Manner of death: undetermined. Cause of death: undetermined. Her surviving relatives: 2 nieces and a nephew, children of a cousin who had long since moved to Indianapolis, attended a small private ceremony that October, 72 years almost to the day after she had driven away from Millbrook Road and failed to arrive for dinner. What they buried was largely symbolic. What they laid to rest was something else entirely. The questions the earth chose not to answer remain open. How was it done without a single witness coming forward across 7 decades? Where did Stephen Clark go after November of 1952, and what did he know? The Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office has stated the investigation remains technically open. Given the passage of time, the death of every witness from that era, and the absence of actionable evidence, what that means in practical terms is difficult to say. What can be said is this: a young woman left work on a cold October Friday with a thermos, a leather satchel, and a silver swallow pinned to her lapel. 12 minutes from home. The swallow made it back in a way. Madison Clark did too, just not the way anyone had hoped, and not the way anyone who loved her had deserved. If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are others like it, waiting to be found.